Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Qatar-America Institute for our first expressions talk on this nice, not too warm or humid day. So thank you so much for coming. Just a little bit about us. We're an independent, non-profit organization to be a meeting space, not necessarily a location, to bring the people of the United States and the people of Qatar together and talk about all the things that are in common we have, all the things that are different that we can celebrate, and to learn about each other. So thank you so much for coming. So I'd like to introduce our guest of honor right now, Dr. Mona Rajkumar. Her award-winning books have focused on various aspects of life in the Arabian Gulf. She currently lives in Qatar with her family, where she teaches writing and literature courses at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar, VCUQ. I don't know if you know, but there are 6 American universities that have campuses in Qatar, and they have the same courses and the same qualifications as they do here. Well, her book, Love Comes Later, which is our focus today, is the sequel to Pearls of the Past. It's a literal romance novel. That's a series that pulls back the veil on life in Qatar to reveal the glimpses of Muslim life rarely seen by Westerners. And she was the winner of the Best Indie Book Award for Romance in 2013, shortlisted for the New Talent Award by the Festival of Romance, and Best Novel finalist in E-Festival of Words in 2013. We also have books on sale. It's not just romance, but there's a detective one which I've started to read. Dr. Mona.
Okay, I think you all can hear me, yes? I realize is for the video. So Thank you, Paul, and thank you to all of the staff here at the Qatar-America Institute for having me. It's such a pleasure. I was telling them as we were putting the event together that usually I give these talks in bookstores to people who have never heard of Qatar and don't really know very much about the Middle East, so it's nice to actually be in front of an audience that has a little bit more knowledge, I think, about our subject today. So I've got a few slides, so I know there's a food coma that's probably going to start soon, so there's only a few of them. So I'll go through those, and then we'll have a little discussion, and you all are free to ask questions. And at any point, if anything I say is intriguing, feel free to put your hand up and ask me a question. It won't be seen as interrupting. It'll be seen as having a dialogue. So as Paul kindly said, these are 4 of my books that are set in Qatar, and there's 2 series. So there's a romance series and a crime series, and I'll let you guess which is which. You know that saying, don't judge a book by its cover? I've never understood that, because of course that's exactly what you're supposed to do with a book cover, at least. And then there's also, you can't have your cake and eat it too. I never understood that. If you have cake, why wouldn't you eat it? So the romance series, actually, I started writing in 2013, and it took me a really, really long time to write. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write it is because I was working with a lot of young Qatari people. As Paul mentioned, I was teaching university, and everyone was talking about the same thing. They were all talking about how were they going to find love. And I found that really interesting, because here we were in a Middle Eastern society that ostensibly practiced arranged marriages, and the family has a lot of input into who your partner is, because often a young couple will live with their parents for the first 5 or so years of their marriage. So they will live with the husband's parents for 5 or so years. So you can imagine what all the considerations are of that kind of living arrangement. And so, yet, when I closed my eyes and I listened to my students, they sounded just like young people here in America or anywhere else in the world. And then what also was interesting to me is that my family is from India, and we immigrated to the US when I was 11 years old. And so my parents had an arranged marriage, their parents had an arranged marriage, all of my cousins. In fact, my siblings and I are the only ones in our set of 13 cousins to not have arranged marriages. Yeah, we're definitely the black sheep of the family. But again, when I closed my eyes, I thought I could be in India and listening to young Indian people think about how they were going to make themselves and their parents happy. So that's sort of how Love Comes Later, which is called the Modern Love series, how that came about. And what's really interesting, I think, for me as a writer is you can live somewhere for a very long time and yet still be an outsider. So it would come, I'd come to write scenes. The opening scene of Love Comes Later happens in the men's Modulus. So as many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, the men's Modulus is in the front of the house, and it's where all the men socialize so that they're, sort of kept away from the private interior, and the women that are socializing and having their privacy, in the interior of the house. Well, I've never been to a men's Modulus. I've been to many female Moduluses, and I've been to many Qatari homes, but I've never been in the men's part of the house. So what did I do? Well, I wrote a scene, and then I thought, I don't even know, do people wear shoes in the Modulus? Do they not wear shoes? What's going on? Do they have, all of their accoutrement on? Or so I called a friend, and I said, listen, I've written this scene, and it would really mean a lot to me if you would read it. And so he says, yeah, sure, send it to me. So I send it to him. And then he calls me back a couple days later. He's like, there's so many weird things about this scene. And I said, really? Tell me. And he's like, you have both sides of the family there. Both sides of the family would not be there. It would either be the whoever's house it is, it would be that grandfather and all of those uncles and brothers and dad, that side of the family, unless it was holiday. And then he's like, and these names, where did you get these names from? So, we went through this whole process of me learning for the first time about Qatari men in particular, because obviously my domain had been very much with female Qatari students. I had taught a majority of Qatari students. So here I was thinking I'm going to write this book about this place that I know so much about, because I had been living there, I think, 5 years when I started writing it. And then in the process of writing it, I realized actually I knew very little. And so that was one of the big gifts, I think, that writers get, is that we get to learn about the world, not as we think it is, but as it actually is. So I wrote romance for a while, and that was really fun. But then there's a lot of, Paul might be the exception, but most male readers would not want to be on the subway with one of these, or on the metro with one of these covers. Now people read on their iPhone and their Kindles, and so although romance readers are very, very dedicated. So I will say Love Comes Later has been my most popular book, and that's the book that people write to me about all the time and say, oh, now when I go into the shopping mall and I see, men, I think, oh, is that Abdullah? Is he like so-and-so? Is that so? For me, that was a big reward. But I also love crime fiction. And, this is just one of those things when you never know how people are influencing you, but I have very good friends who are from Sweden and Uruguay. And so they gave me a book years ago by Henning Mankell, who's an author maybe many of you are familiar with. And I just fell in love with Henning Mankell. I fell in love with Scandinavian fiction, Nordic noir, as they call it. And so for 10 years, I was reading these books, and every birthday they'd give me another book, and I read all the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books. And as I was coming out of the romance series, I started looking around and thinking, small populations, tiny countries, landmass-wise, lots of available GDP and revenue made from oil, which is, all four characteristics that Scandinavian countries and the Gulf share in common. And so then I was like, and I bet that they also have crime, right? So if there were a crime novel set in Qatar, what would it look like? And that's when the Crimes in Arabia series. Sorry, has that been flying around the whole time? I'm so sorry. It's a good thing there are no cats in the room. like going berserk. So that's where Crimes in Arabia has kind of had its origins. Those ideas were percolating for a really long time. So this is like the standard. If you don't know anything about Qatar, here's 30 seconds worth. It's a landmass about the size of Rhode Island. And there it is, it's peninsular. So I grew up in Florida. So when I moved there when I was 25, I felt very much at home between it being geographically close to India and sharing a lot of cultural similarities, and then also the temperature and the climate. And I was like, oh, this is like, has a lot of things that I can relate to. And then I like to share these two photos because this is sort of like a time lapse. This is 2005, the top photo. See, now that I want the red thing, it won't show. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this is 2005, the Corniche. And the Corniches in the Arabian Gulf are an interesting study in and of themselves because every country has one and every country has constructed one. So they're all, human creations. And they very much showcase the projection that the country wants to have of itself or to be seen both in the regional scene and the international scene. So this is now that same road right here in present day. So you can see a lot has changed. And one of the things people like to ask me about is like, oh, you have a PhD in literature, why did you start writing books? It's like, well, I do a lot of academic work, and this is a very intriguing and fascinating graph from one of the studies that I did on how the availability of education has impacted Qatari women's marriage age, the age at which they get married. So the universities that Paul mentioned earlier, that project has been there in Qatar for about 20 or so years. It's a consortium. It started as a consortium of American universities, and now there are universities from other places in the world offering postgraduate degrees as well. And so you can see that the availability of education within the country, university level education, has actually pushed the age at which women are getting married. Now, if anyone is still awake, this is the kind of thing that I spent lots of hours doing and talking to lots of other people, like-minded people in similarly lunch settings. And I just, there wasn't any, I didn't feel that, I'm not devaluing academia or academic research, but it wasn't necessarily what I wanted after having put so much work into something. And that, I would say that is the singular thing that led me to fiction. But I still like to bring the integrity and, even though it's a slightly problematic word, authenticity to the fiction that I would use in my academic work, because I feel that that is my responsibility, my self-appointed responsibility to the reader, is to take him or her to places they might not have been and to understand key features of that place, or to take you back somewhere where you miss being, or that you have passing knowledge of. So I think those are all the slides. Oh, just kidding, there's bonus slides. Again, another contrast. On the left is what we would see that women wore traditionally in traditional Qatari Bedouin society, and also before the urbanization of Qatar. And then on the right, this is the father Emir and his public wife Sheikha Moza, and then of course Nicolas Sarkozy and Carla Bruni. So I find all of these contrasts, when I first moved there, I found them completely overwhelming, and that's to try to understand, and that's why I started blogging. So the roots of my novels and cultural ruminations all started in blogs. And then just to give you a kind of taste of what Qatari families can be like and what the family that is in the Modern Love series is like. This is a family tree, and so you can see there are 3 boys, and so I would say this is actually a small Qatari family. Typically it's somewhere from 5 or 6 siblings, I think, would be a typical size. So Jasm is the grandfather, then he had 3 boys, and then their children. And the series is really based on Jasm's explorations as a pearl diver and a pearling merchant in India, in the Indian Ocean. And then the first book, can I get the red thing to come back? Oh, Mike, I'm pressing so many buttons, sorry.
Here we go.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So, it's going. there it is. So Jasm, the red thing is not coming back. And then Abdullah in the corner and Hind feature prominently in the first book. And then the second book is all about Luluwa, and it also features a jinn, which was really fun to learn about. Although jinn, they're not like ghosts in Western tradition. They're actual spirits. They're made of elements of fire, air, and water. They can be good and bad, and they exist in a parallel universe. They're not supposed to interact with us, but often they do, of course. And the best part was trying to get people to tell me jinn stories, because of course people believe they're real, and you're not supposed to talk about them, because if you talk about them, then you've attracted them. So you can imagine me many nights late in bed, like, oh my God, I've been talking to people about jinn, what's happening? And then also people saying, oh, I love jinn, but I can't talk about it. So it was, you had to persist. And then that is you'll notice this cover is very different than the current cover, and that is back when Love Comes Later was a standalone book, and this cover hints at the love triangle that is at the heart of the story. Dun, dun, dun. Now I think that is the last slide. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This is really interesting. We're going to take questions from the audience, but I've got a few questions to ask first. Could you tell us about your journey from Florida to Qatar? Why?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's really interesting being, a child of immigrants contemporarily, considering everything that's happening in the world. So my father's curiosity took us out of India. We went to Canada, and then we came to the US. And so I think that kind of like almost wanderlust, or constantly looking at the horizon was always there. And certainly, I think many of you live here in the DC area or from here. If we had lived in a bigger place, in a more cosmopolitan place, I think my childhood would have been very different. But in very tiny North Florida, you can imagine what it was like. And so I always felt a yearning to not be the only unique one. I mean, my family was one of maybe 2 or 3 Indian families in our high school. My friend Adrian is here actually from high school, right, Adrian? There weren't that many. Yeah. So I always had that sense, and then when I went to graduate school, and I by chance took this class in women in Islam. So my family is Hindu, so I didn't have like an innate sense of Muslim identity, but at the same time, the world's largest minority population of Muslims lives in India. So as I was reading about these women, I thought, oh, this sounds very, very familiar. Not being able to go outside without an escort, having to wear modest clothing. All of these things are very, any Hindu girl raised, in America is aware of all of these themes. So I just found a lot of similarities. And then I randomly, if you believe in randomness, I was at a conference, and I went to an interview for a job at Georgetown, because Georgetown was opening a campus there. And so I thought, this is the perfect opportunity for me, because I felt that ethically as a scholar I couldn't write about a place I had never lived, to just have that academic knowledge. So I thought, oh yeah, I'll go to Qatar and see what it's like.
And so when you got over there, what were the things you thought were similar to the United States, and what did you think was very different?
Wow, that's a big question. Because I think it's changed a lot as well in the 13 years or so that I've been there. What's interesting is I think a lot of people, when they're recruiting to get people to go over there and work, they say, oh, it's just like home, which is kind of a strange strategy when you think about it, because you think people are looking for adventure, and that's why they want to go overseas. But there's this really funny recruiting video that Sidra, the medical hospital, did, and there's a couple there who are like, it's just like home, look, I have Mrs. Buttersworth, and then she holds up, she literally holds up a jar of the syrup, and she's like, so I love living in Qatar. And on the surface, there are certainly all of those commercial things that I think used to make people uneasy, used to make Americans uneasy about traveling, say in the 80s and 90s. So there's everything from McDonald's to Chili's to what else is Applebee's, Outback. You know, you've got all of that, and then you've got all the brands as well in the store. So there's Gap and there's Jimmy Choo, and you know, I think that tends to make people feel more comfortable because there's things that they recognize. In other ways, I think that Qatar is like America, is that it's a melting pot. I mean, there's literally people from everywhere in the world. It's in the middle of the world, and so you've got so many nationalities and religions and just languages. So that, I think those two things felt very, very familiar.
And so what was the differences? The good differences.
Oh, the differences. How long do we have? I think the thing that is the most different is that the Qataris are a very small population in their own country. And so that is a unique feature, I think, to Qatar. Because when you first get there, and I certainly made this mistake too, is I was like, and I would say to people, this is cringeworthy, I know, I'd say to people, like, I'm looking for a Qatari friend. Would you like to be mine? You know, I've never been one to beat about the bush. So you'd be surprised to hear that strategy did not work as effectively as I thought it was going to. So in many ways, and Qataris are used to the revolving door that ends up being expat life. So when I first moved there, the average expat lived there for 3 years. And then it was it was getting to maybe 5 years. And now that we've been there 13 years, we're pretty much the only people we know. But now I'm very interesting to the Qataris because they're like, oh, you're still here. Okay. But also, as we saw, you know, Qataris have very large families. So it took me a really long time to understand, you know, if you have anywhere from 14 to 60 cousins, why would you make a new friend who's going to leave in 3 years? You know, that's a lot of social capital that you're constantly putting out for very little return. And one of my friends really laughs at me because I started saying a while ago, like, oh, I'm not making any new friends. Because expats, you know, they leave, and then when they leave, they take themselves and all your memories with them, and they leave you behind. So
it's actually very similar to DC.
yes,
you know, people
yes,
do come in
I'm sure
with
any
administrations.
transient community, yeah.
It's getting better. Yeah, but so you've been there for 13 years, and after what happened on Sunday in the World Cup in Russia. It now moves to Qatar in 4.5 years' time. What are the changes you're already seeing that Qatar, the small country, is going to host one of the biggest events the world has ever seen?
Well,
big question.
I was just going to say, you just love all these Paul's like, we fed you lunch. Now we're gonna get our lunch's worth out of you. Well, I was there in 2006 for the Asian Games, and so the Asian Games, I didn't know this, and maybe many of you are more sports minded, but the Asian Games is the largest sporting event outside of the Olympics in the world. And so when Qatar was hosting the Asian Games, where the street where I lived was, I think it was a 4-lane road, so 2 lanes going in each direction, and then the street that you would turn to from there was a 2-lane road going one way, and now it's an 8-lane highway. You know, so I mean, it was a very complicated process to get there, but the amount of infrastructure that goes into hosting, you know, being a host nation, not just the stadiums but the hospitals and the transportation infrastructure. We're going to get a metro finally, thanks to the World Cup. So there are a lot of people that have been working really, really hard for a long time to get ready.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to open it up for questions in the audience. You just put your hand up and just tell us who you are and then ask a question. There we go.
What do you feel about people saying that Qatari are very private and they appreciate their privacy in comparison to the other, let's say, GCC nations because they're pretty close? Do you notice that yourself as well as an expat?
I mean, the Qatari are very private, and I think I would be as well, because there's so much talking about them, you know, that they almost don't have to say anything because it's not like anyone asks them, you know, like, is this true? You're very private. Is this true? You know, I've never, I've never heard that conversation. And I wouldn't blame them, because it is a very strange thing to be a minority in your own country. You know, when you think, you know, when you come home, whatever home is to you, you think, oh, I'm home, right? Whereas I think in the Gulf countries, that's a very different kind of proposition. I will say that since the blockade, things have changed a lot in terms of how nationals and expats interact. I think people, we have a much more sense of like, oh, we're all in this together. You know, the emir has come out very publicly, almost nonstop throughout the year, and said, you know, we work together. I'm proud of my Qataris, and I'm also thankful for the expats, and that's meant a lot. That's a big shift, I think, in tone.
It's really interesting.
Hi, very nice to be here. I do have one question in terms of like the westernization in Qatar. So as you know, like in the GCC countries, it's been a climb for modernization and westernization. But being that Qataris are a minority in their own country, do you think that has kind of set them back in some ways or in some way or another?
I think
in that advance.
Yeah, the phases of development in the GCC are really interesting. So, you know, Saudi, of course, found their oil first, and then did a set number of things with it, and then Kuwait, and then Bahrain, and then the UAE, and then Qatar. So what Qatar has done really interestingly is look around and learn from the lessons, you know, of her neighbors, and then also each country has sort of decided the thing that it's going to be known for, and really kind of put all their efforts into that. So, you know, for the UAE, it's definitely this idea of like a playground, you know, come and be here. We have the biggest and the tallest and the fastest and all those kinds of things. And the Qataris, I think from the very beginning, weren't willing to do that. They didn't want to give up their cultural, sort of their cultural center. And so that's why, you know, instead of kind of these almost like amusement park style attractions, they've done things like Qatar or the Museum of Islamic Arts, you know, really try to position and choose medicine, sidra, and sports with the World Cup. You can definitely see the different eras, even if when you look across in terms of buildings from Saudi to Qatar, if you look across the Gulf, you can see the era of the skyscraper, you know, the era of we have to be Western, we have to project this Western image, like we saw on the Corniche, because that's what will make them come and invest with us, right? 'Cause when they see these structures that look like the structures in their home countries, and every country in their second phase of development, you can see a return to heritage architecture. I mean, you can almost predict it in the 10th year of the second. So the end of the first phase and into the second phase, there's a clamoring for, you know, what about, Islamic architecture? What about heritage cooling practices? You know, why do we have these glass refrigerators in the desert? It doesn't make sense. These are the most energy intensive buildings that they are. So I think that's the phase that Qatar specifically is in right now, where now they've solidified their base, they've solidified their position, and now they definitely want to be including their own identity in everything that they do.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. Could you shed some light on how the government supports the arts? And also, what changes, if any, have you seen within the last year in the art scene, the literary scene, in light of the blockchain?
Well, it's really interesting because the government is the innovator. So the government is a funder and the innovator. So when you look at the Museums Authority, that's technically an NGO, but it's actually a GO. Same thing for QF, same thing for the Film Institute. And what we see in other places is a grassroots movement. Someone makes a little film, it gets a lot of attention, then it gets bigger, and so then other people make little films. Whereas I think in a top-down structure, you almost have to have so-and-so is the patron of such and such to inspire other people to get started. I would like to see more emphasis given to creative writing. I mean, there is some focus on script writing, but the books, in English at least, I mean, there's a rich tradition of writing in Arabic from lots of nationalities that are based in Qatar and by Qatari authors in particular. So it'd be really nice to see that transition over into larger numbers and into some kind of official program. For years, we've been clamoring for an MFA, so Modern Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing in Education City, because there's, and it's not just novelists, there's poets, there's memoirists, but we haven't yet been successful.
And I mean, you've got young kids in Qatar. How do they like it?
I would say it's one of the best places that I could have ever dreamt to have had children. Two reasons. One, because our children are from a multi-ethnic family. So my family is from India and the U.S. and my husband's family is from Laos and Thailand, and so they are not the only ones. In their classroom, they're not even special. There's a kid, whose mom is Brazilian, whose dad is, Pakistani, and a pilot, and the kid speaks 4 languages, and so I'm like, oh, our kids only speak one. So from that perspective, I think they're being given such a rich environment, and then you have lots of really interesting conversations at the playground. Like the other day, the 7-year-old came home and he was like, so-and-so said, church is a place of lies. And he's like, Mom, why do we go to church if it's a place of lies? And I said, well, what did you say? And I said, no, it's not. And then I said, well, what did he say? And he said, well, yes, it is. I said, okay.
It's like Congress.
I'm just going to leave that alone.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, did you want to play with him? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, well, the next time someone says that to you, say to them, we're not going to agree about this, but do you want to do something else? And he's like, okay. So, I feel like those are the conversations that maybe we have not been fortunate enough to have here, because we don't necessarily bump up against people who are so radically different from us. I mean, there are at least 40 conversations like that I could tell you about with the boy. They're 7 and 5, but I find that so enriching for them, because I can't. If you're starting at 7 with plurality and acceptance and difference, where are you going to end up? I hope somewhere in a better place than we are right now, globally.
And speaking of that, and your academic studies, you were on a radio interview last week, and you got some really interesting questions about Muslim women, and marriage, and traditional dress, and stuff like that. And linking back with the books, can you go into what you were saying and your thoughts on marriage in itself, and where especially Qatar is and Muslim women are in that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the study, the field of study that I went to, it is literature, but it's post-colonial literature, so it's the study of places that were formerly colonized. And the rule number one in post-colonial literature is you cannot assume to speak for the other. But yet here I am in this situation where even when I was starting to write the books, I'm writing in the voice of someone who I'm completely not. I'm not male, I'm not Qatari, I'm not Muslim, I'm not Arab. But that's why the research is important, I think, to then at least hopefully I'm overcoming my own biases. And I have beta readers, so I have people read it and tell me, no, all of this is wrong, or this is kind of right, but I think this is what you actually mean, or this is how it actually play out. And one of the biggest areas, I think, is this idea that Muslim women are oppressed. And I'm not saying that we're not practicing cultural relativism. I don't think that there are some women who are oppressed. Okay, there are women in this country, who are facing domestic challenges and other challenges. But it's nowhere near in the majority or the numbers that. I don't know. I hate to say the media because everyone's beating up on the media lately, but that the conversation would lead you to believe. So, for example, one of the things that used to drive me crazy and why I decided to start writing as well is I'd go to Virgin Megastore and you'd walk up to a table and it would be like the title of the table should have been the covers of books with only eyes. Because they were all it was like the princess series is the worst, right? So it's all women who are in like niqab or like some kind of scarf, and all you can see are these like heavily made up eyes, and it's like princess of darkness, prisoner of my demise, or whatever. And all these books have one theme, right? This poor oppressed woman who had to escape her family and then run away to be rescued by someone, usually a male and often an American. I mean, it's literally the same narrative in different books. And again, we're not saying that hasn't happened to people or that's not a story, but I'm surprised by how much space that occupies, because the majority of Muslim women that I know, and not just Qatari women, but Indian Muslims and Pakistani Muslims, and they're proud of their heritage. If a woman is wearing a scarf, 95% of the time, it's her choice to wear that scarf. She's wearing it because of her faith, and that's how she thinks she should be living it out. And I think we could be a little bit more self-reflective. It's hard in the era, I think, of the Kardashians, when everything is me, like show me, to understand why someone would want to not show everything, because we being Western society place such a high value on that. So I think that's what that's about, that contrast or that misread of, I can't see your hair. That why would anyone choose that? Somebody must have made you do that.
Yeah, and so that links with your crime novels and the migrants. Who I've to be honest, I've just started.
You don't have to disclose politics.
There's been lots of media stories about migrant rights and workers' rights in Qatar. A lot of misconceptions. How do you feel in Qatar itself that's being addressed?
It's such a complex issue, and I think this is the other benefit of being a host country, in that you've got to look internally, and deal with things. This is, people were divided on China being an Olympic host, I guess now almost a decade or so ago, but the Olympics was great for China in that it actually forced them to open up and to be a little bit more transparent. I'm not saying that all the issues in Chinese society have been solved, but just the sheer fact that you're going to have to be more open and people are coming can only be good. I think it's very funny when an organization like FIFA, that has its own considerations, likes to point fingers at other people. I just find ironies like that really amusing. And on the whole, when you look at workers' rights, the World Cup has actually really improved things for the labor force in Qatar. Now you have much improved accommodations. There's more shopping and entertainment also available for the men, because it is an all male workforce, at least on the construction end of things. So what I find encouraging is that people are actually willing to consider and put resources behind and work on those things, because it's definitely an issue. But I also, what country doesn't have their issues? I mean, right now the situation of migrants along the southern border in this country is horrifying, and you would have never thought that would be a situation that we would find ourselves in, and yet here we are. So what I like to see is the flexibility and the willingness and the progress that has been made.
That's great. And a couple of final questions. If anybody's got questions, put the hand up.
I have. What is your latest book in the romance series, and what is your latest book in the migrant labor?
In the crime series. So the romance series, Love Comes Later, took me 3 years to write. I mean, like 3 years of hard going, to the point where no one wanted to be my friend anymore. Because every time I saw one of my Qatar friends, I'd be like, "Hey, can you read this?" It's like, "No, she's going back with pages." And then the second one, so I thought, right, I've done that. The sequel is just gonna roll off the fingertips. It took another 3 years because I hadn't prepared for the jinn element to be as complicated, both in trying to get people to talk about them and then also trying to weave it into the story itself. So there is a third book in the next book. The most recent book has been Pearls of the Past, so the hard one sequel in the romance series. But the next book is actually in the crime series, and it features ISIS. But I am still looking for a good substitute name for ISIS. So let me know if you think of one, because I am the mother of young children. I would like for them not to come after me. So.
Quick question: Have you experienced any censorship issues with your academic freedom and your creativity in some of what you've published?
So academic freedom, definitely not. I will say the universities in Education City enjoy, they're there by invitation, and so they definitely enjoy a wide latitude. Like I've taught Girls of Riyadh, which some of you might have heard of. It was written by that young Saudi woman, probably 10 or 12 years ago. She was actually even banned from coming back to Saudi Arabia based on this book, and it's why I think even though it's love stories, or it's the Girls of Riyadh is a group of girls and they're all trying to find love, and it's based on emails and things that happened to her and her friends, and so these seem like very innocuous, almost like chick lit. But yet it's very political, right? Because these are people who are trying to find their own way and make their own path. And so that quickly becomes very political, in very collective societies. So I think most of the faculty in the Education City consortium would say that they enjoy a wide degree of academic freedom. In my own writing, I would definitely love to see these books in the bookshops in Doha. The challenge is, because of a lot of the suspicion of expats, longstanding suspicion of expats, I think a lot of people would right off the bat assume that these books were either making fun of or inappropriately representing Qataris. And so I haven't really pushed that in the last few years. So it is an irony that the people that I'm writing about might not necessarily get to read those books, but maybe it will come.
I've got two final questions. First of all is, people who've never been to Qatar before, I know there's a couple in the audience who are going in the next few months. What should they do?
What should they do?
Yeah.
Oh, this is funny because
Yeah.
we had a dinner earlier this week with somebody who's about to move there
Yeah.
for work. I would say, go with an open mind. And the statement I always give to people when they're going to another country for the first time, whether it's Qatar or anywhere else, is when you notice your reactions to things and when you react, remind yourself it's not wrong. It's just different, you know? And then there's wrong and different, different and wrong. But hopefully the wrong and different list is very small. And I think if you can stay in that space of like, this isn't wrong, it's just different, you know? I don't...
What do you like to do on your days off?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the time of year, but you can, there's so many parks there, like Aspire Park is beautiful. They've imported trees from Argentina, the boab trees, the ones that look like bottles. Or you can go to the dunes, so you could go to the beach. If you're into brunch, it's definitely a brunch culture, and brunch is from like 12:30 to 4 p.m. So it's not, you know, they brunch seriously there. Brunching is like a sport. I think those are probably the things that people do the most often. Some of these ladies live there for a while.
Islamic art, the museum.
Right, the museums, and everyone loves Mia, which not to take anything away from Mia because this is being recorded. I love the Museum of Islamic Art, but I love Metaf actually, the Museum of Modern Arab Art, because they're always having new collections, and the National Museum is going to be open soon, and there are a number of private galleries like in Souk Waqif and on the Pearl.
And the library is...
The library is beautiful.
Yeah.
So the National Library has just opened and has pretty much every book I think that's ever been published. Yeah.
And so final question is, what next?
What next?
Yeah.
Like today or
Book-wise.
book-wise? Well, this is 10 years of my writing and writing about the Gulf. So I was just saying to a friend, I'm not entirely sure. After the third book in the crime series comes out, I'm not sure what's next. So that as an author, that's a really interesting place to be. Slightly terrifying at the same time too, because I don't know who I am if I'm not writing a book. I write a manuscript every November. I write 50,000 words as part of National Novel Writing Month. So if anyone here is an aspiring writer this November, every day, all you have to do is write 1,600 words, and then you'll have a manuscript. But usually in May, I'm planning the book for November, and right now, nothing's happening. So, but I think the ISIS book is going to be really interesting. So it's going to take up most of my time until then.
Well, Dr. Mona, thank you so much. I
Thank
think you've been an inspiration to us here. It's been absolutely wonderful, and the books are available to purchase here and on Amazon.
That's right.
And I don't get a cut. But I'd like to thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.